Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Carroll PMC's video interview series. I'm excited to have you with me today as we discuss another's journey through medicine. And today, like always, I have a special guest, two special guests for you all. Shelby and Eric Hinds. Our distinguished Sergeant of Arms met this couple while ice climbing, where they voiced their desire to speak about their experiences to undergraduates regarding medicine. Shelby is a fourth-year medical student, and Eric is a first-year medical student at the University of Michigan School of Medicine. So let's jump right in and say hello to Eric and Shelby. Eric and Shelby, welcome to Carroll PMC's video interview series. It's great to have you guys with us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, great to be here.
When did you both realize you wanted to be physicians?
Sure. So it's a very different time for both of us, even though we're the same age and went to college at the same year. I discovered that I wanted to be a physician during my college years. We went to Dartmouth together, and I decided a little bit late in my junior year of college. So I did quite a few of the pre-med classes there, and then I did a couple more, finished out my classes with a post-bac, and then went to straight into medical school from that. Eric is a very different timeline for me, so I'll let him talk about that.
Yeah, I didn't have a single moment. I would say it was a process. I don't take decisions lightly, and I knew medicine was a long road. So I actually went into college thinking, maybe I'll do medicine. But I ended up getting interested in the Arab world and Middle East policy because I entered college around the time of the Arab Spring. And I ended up living in Cairo and later living in Jordan for a year, and going down a path to become a policymaker, focusing on Middle East policy. Eventually, I realized that while that was a really interesting field, it was lacking some things I wanted out of a career, like more direct engagement with people and something that challenged me physically and emotionally and intellectually. All those things I found hard to find in sort of the desk job world that I was in. And meanwhile, Shelby had started medical school, so I was getting to see the great aspects of medical school where you can kind of combine all those things I was talking about. So from there, I took a job as an EMT and did some other things to make sure I really, really enjoyed the hospital environment, and that's where I wanted to be, and then finally applied to med school after all that. So it was a longer process, but I'm glad to have done it that way because now I have no doubts about where I am.
Right, yeah, and oftentimes that's what's pushed by a lot of medical schools and a lot of advisors is to get engage in direct clinical experiences as a way to sort of certify that medicine is what you want to do. And so it sounds like you did that through EMTing. Shelby, besides the post-bac, just working with sciences further, I don't know, what area did you study in the post-bac that you did?
I studied, I studied mostly the pre-med classes during my post-bac, so it was pretty standard undergraduate classes. But outside of that, I had a few clinical experiences, definitely not as robust and broad as Eric, just because I was younger at the time. But I worked at a breast cancer clinic in Washington, D.C., and I volunteered there for about a year. And then I had also worked in some other spaces that were more community service oriented. So I worked at a homeless shelter for women and children in Miami, Florida, which is my hometown, for a long period of time. Over 6 years, I worked there on and off, which wasn't a direct medical experience, but definitely gave me exposure to some of the social determinants of health and the complexities of insurance undercoverage in America. So I had those two experiences, but definitely hadn't been exposed to as much of the hospital as you had, Eric, as an EMT, which is good and bad. I think I wish I had probably had a little bit more experience before jumping into the hospital because it's a little bit of a rude awakening, I think, when you're a clinical student. But, I think both of our different paths gave us an interesting perspective.
Yeah. And I think, it's really helpful to have direct clinical experiences, but like prospective medical students shouldn't think that those experiences have given them the full picture of what it's like to practice as a physician. So I actually think, obviously, you're missing out on all the intellectual aspects of medicine. You're seeing the environment and you're seeing how care is provided, but you sort of are missing out on the thought process, which for me is actually the really interesting part of medicine. So you want to make sure that you enjoy that environment enough, but know that it will also get even more interesting once you're in medical school, which I was surprised by.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially for Carroll students in particular, because our community has one major hospital. And for patients, really, if you don't like this hospital, it's an hour, 2 or 3 hour drive to then another facility. And so for patients, that's one issue. But then also for Carroll pre-medical students in particular, and anyone who wants to be a doctor in Montana, it's really oftentimes the shadowing and the experiences take place firefighting, or being an EMT in a private ambulance company like myself, or shadowing and working in a rural health clinic in some smaller town. And I don't know, some of those experiences, and oftentimes it's hard to get into the one local hospital we have, but oftentimes those experiences grew me into, or showed me some of the social determinants, or the effect that poverty in particular has on access to medical care. And those were more than enough problems or issues that were truly a motivating factor for me and countless other pre-meds at Carroll to enter into medicine. And I want to elaborate more particular on undergrad, if anything. Both of you guys were non-traditional applicants, so maybe this it doesn't have as much weight with you guys, but for Carroll pre-meds, we're undergrads. And so what skills, if any, did you pick up from your undergraduate experiences that you believe are helping you thrive now as medical students?
Yeah, we thought about this a little bit. I think the number one thing, and it sounds really simple and basic, but you just need to be able to sit in a chair or stand at your standing desk, wherever that is, and consume lots of information for many, many hours on end. So you have to sort of enjoy that process for years in a row, because medicine is all about learning lots of information and learning a new way of thinking. And I have friends that are much farther along in the process, and that doesn't end for a long time, through training and residency and all that. So I think the first thing is just learning how to learn and enjoying that process. Other than that, I think what's great about undergrad is you can explore different subjects and do your pre-medical work, and then also get experience in some other fields, whether that's some government classes you might take, or philosophy or literature, any endless number of things, and just learn how to critically analyze ideas in a diverse array of fields. Because in medical school, you have to learn the science, but you also have to know how to conceptualize these other things that we've been talking about, like the social determinants of health, and be able to have a perspective on health policy and health economics. So it's nice to have a framework to sort of analyze other ideas that are outside of science.
Yeah, and I think for me, my biggest takeaway from my undergraduate years was a little different from Eric's. It's a little bit more grounded in tools that I learned about self-management. So how to deal with coping with stress, how to deal with, the basic things of life that we all have to do, and especially during medical school, get more and more challenging because you're trying to squeeze them into these little windows of freedom that you have. So really learning how to respect myself, how to take care of myself, while also pushing myself academically. And I think that's a little underestimated. At least for me, that was a big learning experience. And I'm glad that I had that going into medical school, because I was able to support myself and take care of myself. And then I also just wanted to go back to what you just said about kind of transforming the unique aspects of being a Carroll student, and not having as much access to maybe a big tertiary care hospital that other students might have across the country. I think I really liked how you put a perspective of staying, excuse me one second, I had to exit out of a pop-up.
A few moments later.
Okay.
I don't know if that was us or you. And I also don't know where we got cut off, because I was rambling.
I think you said you were going along the lines of complimenting something I said, which thank you for that. It was probably something along the lines of access to resources, how it's limited in Helena, but not letting that limit our exploration.
Yeah. I think what I was trying to say was that I really liked how you reframed kind of the unique access or lack of access to certain things that you have as students in Montana. And I think when you are a pre-medical student and you're going into the process of trying to get into medical school, you can often think that all medical students are these like perfect, well-rounded robots who have had, extensive experience in hospitals and are, the first author on multiple research papers, but that's really not the case. Even at a top medical school like University of Michigan, where we're at, medical school is full of normal humans that have shortcomings and various different backgrounds. And I think coming from the place that you are, where you might not have access to a tertiary care hospital, or your experience might be more in rural medicine or firefighting or whatever it is, I really would encourage you to frame that as a positive, because medical schools would be so interested to hear that during an interview. And I think it gives you a great perspective, and we need more people like you.
Yeah, that was well said. So pursuing a career in medicine in the 21st century requires one to take on quite a large amount of risk. Many of us as pre-medical students in Montana seek adventures in the mountains that show us what it means to seek the limits of nature and constantly question the merits of our risks that we take. So as medical students, what do the outdoors mean to you?
Yeah, well, I thought a lot about this. I love the outdoors. I've been going into the mountains since I was a kid. And that's one of the things that ultimately drew me back to medicine, was sort of the parallels that I saw between, being up in the big mountains and putting yourself on a challenging path like medicine. I think it's sort of, just like climbing a mountain, you have to take things one small step at a time, as cliche as it sounds. The same thing is true of the path of medicine. And another thing that strikes me is that it challenges you in all these unique ways. Being in the mountains, you're having to calculate risk, adapt to changing weather and difficult objective and subjective hazards, and just push yourself when you're tired. And you can find all those things on the path of medicine. Maybe not, it's not physically risky, but you're putting yourself out there and going through a lot of education, putting yourself out on a limb. So having that experience in the mountains made me seek something challenging in a career, and I think medicine is a good fit for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really love this question. It's something that we do together a lot, even before we started our journey in medicine. And it means a lot to us to be able to go out into the mountains. And I think I look at it as a little bit different from Eric. He's more of a go out and push and obtain an objective kind of outdoorsman. I'm a little bit more of a go out and appreciate the beauty of how small we are kind of an outdoors woman. But I think we complement each other well in that regards. And I will say that one thing that has surprised me about medical school is how much opportunity, if you take advantage of it, there is for going out and traveling, of course, pre-COVID, but going out, traveling, finding adventures. Even if you're in a school, you could be in, for example, my friend goes to medical school in New York City, and she even still has been able to take advantage of the little golden weekends that she has off, or weeks off that, accumulate over 4 years, and you can have some really big adventures. So love that question. And there's been a few times where we've definitely challenged ourselves. We've done a lot of climbing in the Sierras over our medical school, 10 years medical students doing some of the big peaks out there. So that has been fun, and I think we've both grown a lot out of those experiences.
Would you say that the Sierra Mountains is your greatest adventure, or what was the most riskiest, most challenging endeavor you guys have done?
What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, that's a great question. The most probably some of the more risky things I've done are in the Andes. In undergrad, a friend and I took a trip to the Andes, and we didn't have much experience, but got in over our heads a little bit on some bigger peaks, which was a lot of fun, and it all worked out okay. And he's actually a emergency medicine resident now. But yeah, this summer we had a fun experience. We did a little honeymoon road trip and climbed Mount Russell, which is a 14er in California, and the East Ridge, which is sort of a classic, moderate ridge climb, but with a lot of exposure. And Shelby, you hadn't really done something like that before with as much exposure. So that was fun. I was sort of pushing you, and you were pushing me in some ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah, that was definitely more on the spectrum of challenge versus just get out and enjoy nature. And also with on the spectrum of more challenge and then just enjoy is the MCAT, which both of you had to get through to get into medical school, and is what the test that every pre-med has to get through. So alluding to that, what study advice or tips and strategies would you recommend to students who are preparing to take the MCAT in 2021?
I'm going to defer to Eric on this one because you took it much more recently than me. And I took when I took the MCAT, it was a little bit different than it is now.
Yeah, so I just took it. I was in a little bit of a unique situation since I was this non-traditional applicant. I actually did a 1-year intensive post-bac last year. So I just took all of the pre-med classes in 1 year and then took the MCAT right after that. So a lot of my studying was sort of built in, but I think I took away some things from that experience. I think the first was just mastering the material is possible. So some other tests you think about, you have to, it's testing your inherent intelligence, your ability to reason quickly under pressure. I don't think the MCAT is quite like that. I actually think you can master all the material on the MCAT. And so I think it's worth doing. And the way that I did that, and a lot of my peers in the program I did last year did that, was by just reading through one of the series of prep books. So we used Exam Crackers, which is sort of this, it doesn't seem like a great set of prep books, but what's nice about it, it's not as polished as some of the others like Princeton Review or Kaplan. But what me and my peers found great about it was that it's really condensed and just stripped down to all that you need to know. So it was sort of easy to go through the stack of all the books and all the subjects in a week or two of reading. And so you could go through them a couple times and really master just all the essential information. And so I think that's number one, just knowing everything that's on the test can boost your score a huge amount. I think number two, using flashcard apps like Anki for certain sections. I found that really helpful for Psych Soc. There's about 800 terms and definitions you really need to know for that. And if you don't have a background in psychology, it can be helpful to just do an Anki deck or a Quizlet deck of all the Psych Soc terms you need to know and just straight up memorize them. So that was helpful. And then I think doing as many practice tests as you can, the full length ones, is really helpful as well, just to measure and track your progress. But yeah, I mean, I would give the advice to folks that the MCAT is really where you can do extremely well by just dedicating yourself and putting in a little extra time, and that'll really boost you up in terms of the admissions process. Just get your application a definite look. So I think it's worth doing well, even if that means you have to take another year before you apply. I think it's worth doing well in the MCAT.
Yeah, what as far as, so you did the 1 year intensive post-bac, how many months did you dedicate to studying for the MCAT after that?
Yeah, so I had let's see, probably 3 weeks of just dedicated study to the MCAT, something like that. So not very long, but again, since I was doing all the courses during the previous year, it was all fresh in my mind, so I didn't have to do as much review of all the things I would have learned in undergrad as you might have to if that process has been spaced out over years. So I think, yeah, I think I studied intensively for about 3 weeks for the actual test.
And I think that studying for the MCAT is a huge exercise, ultimately, in my opinion, on finding out what your personality is and how you study the best, because you just have to figure that out. I mean, nothing is going to work for you that works for someone else. You have to figure out what your personality is. So for example, Eric just said that he studied for 3 weeks very intensively, and I think that works for him. For me, I'm like more of a person that likes to take a break in the middle of the afternoon, have a cup of tea, whatever it is, I'm lazy basically. And so I needed a bigger period of time. And I also needed to know that, I am just all kinds of things that come out of your personality. Like, so for example, I needed to be aware that if I got questions wrong, I took that personally and it made me feel bad about myself. And I needed to steel myself and realize that and figure out like, okay, every question you can get right. It's possible to get every question right. It's just a matter of learning that material. It has nothing to do with your worth as a human being. And so figuring out what makes you tick, how long it takes you to absorb material, there's no right answer. There's no way to do it the best way, but the most successful students, and we both did really well in the MCAT, I think it's because we both knew ourselves and have a degree of self-awareness that we figured out what was going to work for us.
Yeah. And I'll just say, reemphasize that just don't let the MCAT limit you. So you should, don't try not to take the test until you're about where you want to be with those practice tests, and know that you can make huge strides. You can start out like halfway through last year. I think I was getting, a certain score, and it boosted by like 30 points by the end of the year. So know that just by knowing that material, it's really not a test of innate test taking skill or something like that. It really
It's not about you.
It's really about the material. So
Yeah.
I think that's helpful, that folks can know, even if they're not doing great on practice tests now, they can go back, address their weaknesses, and really boost their score a lot.
Yeah, and we've talked about sort of how to attack the test before on this video interview series, and it's hard because it's not a test that you can, I guess you could just prepare for to take a test. Like, you ever study to take a test, and where it's like you know what to expect before it's even there. There's some elements of predictability on the MCAT. And then there's also some essential content that you have to know too. And that was sort of how it was when I took it. And you can't really prepare to take the test. You can't predict the entire test, but you also can't memorize every single content, every single little fact, at least without dedicating an immense amount of time. I like how you mentioned exam crackers. They are a very defined form of MCAT study tool. And really, like you said, Shelby, it is about what works best for you. I know, doing some research when I was taking it, Princeton Review was postulated as if you wanted some really, really high score because they went in depth. And they almost went to the point of excess knowledge on some things. Whereas Kaplan was more basic and broad, like more of a broad overview and a little bit more easier to read. And that was actually the decision I took based off of just certain personality factors with myself and how I felt about content. And I agree that everybody else should look at it the same way and do that sort of analysis. And in reality, the MCAT only makes up one part of an applicant. You guys know for yourselves that in applying to medical school, they want your personal statements, they want reflections, they want to see that you're a person through an interview, GPA, etc. And so what was one thing that both of you overestimated and one thing that both of you underestimated about the medical school admissions process?
That's exactly right, what you said about, they really are looking for people. And you could have the literally a perfect MCAT score, and you might not be a good fit for that school. So I think we were both trying to think about this question before this interview, and I think I'm in an interesting period right now because I'm doing my residency interviews, and they've been very different and also very similar to medical school residencies. Of course, this year the main difference is that they're all virtual, which really gives a different feeling to interviews, I have to say. For medical school interviews, they were all in person. At University of Michigan, I'll never forget one particular thing is that they gave us coloring books for the waiting room times because they were just so aware that this is a stressful thing. And so one thing I think I underestimated was that, there's other people on the end of this interview trail. They're also human beings. They're aware that this is a very stressful period of time, and they're just trying to do everything they can to mediate that and mitigate that and make you feel okay. And so I think that's important to remember, that they're humans and that they want you just as much as you want them, and that should make you feel confident. What's something that you think you overestimated?
Yeah, I guess I would call that like overestimation, right? Like I think we overestimated the extent to which when you got to the interview stage, there were like kind of gotcha questions,
right,
or they were trying to trip you up with, maybe you've done some job interviews where they've really tried to challenge you. I think we both found that once you got to the actual interview stage, they were just trying to get to know you and make sure that they were someone that they'd want to be teaching and working with over a period of time. And that's what you found with the residency interviews as well.
Yeah, they're really evaluating your interpersonal skills, and they want to hear about your story. And it's important that you've really polished your narrative, and you're prepared to answer questions about yourself and have a strong sense of self. But yeah, I still am surprised, even during residency interviews, by how just casual and getting to know you the questions are. it's always a little bit disarming because you go in with this shield of armor and you're like, I'm going to be the perfect interviewer, but it's really not about that. It's about your interpersonal skills, your collegiality, how you interact with the interviewer, and how you present yourself.
Yeah. And then as far as underestimate, I think sort of the opposite. Don't underestimate or how important it is to have a well-written application, because that's what will get you to that interview stage where then you can relax and just show your collegiality and be in that a little. It's actually, once you get there, you have a good chance of getting some great offers. So yeah, I think for me and my colleagues that went through the process just this last year, you shouldn't underestimate how much time you should spend crafting those activities part of your application. That can actually be pretty impactful, even though it seems kind of like a small part of the package. And then obviously your personal statement. Your personal statement it could hurt you a little bit maybe if it wasn't so well done, or it could just be sort of neutral. Or if you really spend time working on that narrative and coming up with a vision of how you can use your unique background and skills to impact medicine in some way, that could really boost you and be a real advantage. So yeah, don't underestimate how helpful it can be to really have a well-written application.
Yeah, that's really well said. Because I heard throughout the whole application process, and currently I'm in the interview stage of that. What has been pushed on me at least is to, if anything, not overthink the interview process, but also be extremely definitive in what were the motivations and what were your pathway to pursue medicine. If anything, that was the most important thing. Correct me if I'm wrong with this, but that was one of the biggest things, was to at least be able to define and explain clearly what got you here and what is going to commit you through this arduous process. That was something that was really pertinent, established as pertinent by advisors throughout the entire application process. So much so that it is quite hard to disarm myself now as I prepare for interviews, and I've heard it's the same for countless other pre-meds at Carroll as well.
Yeah. That's I love that piece of advice, and I think it really is true that that's the little pearl that's going to keep you going. And so the self-awareness to really be able to define and be honest about what is pushing me to this point and what is my motivation. I think it's tremendously helpful, both just for your interior life, because I can guarantee you that there's going to be times where you're going to ask yourself, why did I do this? It just gets so challenging, and you're low on sleep or whatever it is. And you need to do that self-exploration and figure out what it is, not only to have a great interview answer, a way to answer that question on the interview trail, but also just to hold that and know that internally. I think it's extremely important, and it will serve you well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And then I'll just say something that's a little different, but also true, which I heard from a dean of admissions recently, is that once you're in med school, no one's going to hold you to what your vision was for why you wanted to do medicine, or what exactly you wanted to do when you laid out your vision and interview process. So kind of feel free to dream and come up with something that speaks to you during that interview process, but don't feel like it needs to be like perfect, because everyone understands that once you get to medicine, you'll find so many different paths, and you might do something totally different. So you don't need to feel locked in by whatever your narrative is kind of going into the process.
Right. And then that's not dishonest. It's just being open to whatever your dream is in this present moment, and that's going to mutate and change along the way.
Yeah.
So medical school is hard. Maintaining a relationship is hard. And you two have managed to combine the two and balance the demands of both. So explain the pros and cons of being in a quote-unquote medical relationship. What advice do you have for other aspiring doctors regarding relationships?
Yeah, it hasn't been easy, but I will say that it's been tremendously worthwhile, and I'm so glad that we are where we are. I think I don't think everyone would agree with me on this, but my own personal mantra and my own personal belief is that it's very important to put your own loved ones and your own life, to always put that first. So for me, medical school is a big part of my life and an important part of how I define who I am and my identity, but it's not the only thing. And I have always prioritized my family, my relationship with Eric. That's something that I schedule in. Literally, if I have my year, I'll schedule in those things first, and then medical school fills in the gaps, not the other way around. And I think different people do it differently. My classmates handle that differently, but that was just something that I knew going into medical school. And I also had other things like my sister. I have a nephew now that he was born during medical school, and I was there for his birth, and I've been there for all of his big first moments. And so I think it's important to decide if that's important to you or not. It's okay if it's not. You know, family members are also very understanding. And if you miss big important events like a wedding and things like that, you have a great excuse. You're in medical school. But you need to understand what's important to you and what you want to be there for.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. I think that's the main thing. Yeah. I mean, I think it can be helpful that we're both in medicine at this point, finally, because we understand the demands of med school and the process. And so we can be tolerant with each other when we have to dedicate, you know, a lot of time 1 month to medicine, and then we can relax a little bit and spend more time together the next month. So that understanding is nice to have. I think one of the big challenges is just ending up in the same place. So, you know, I sort of had to go to medical school at Michigan. So that was challenging to try to line all that up, and it ended up working out. But
right. And now I quote unquote have to go to residency. So
right,
we're doing this leapfrog thing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, it's not just in medicine, but any couple of any two individuals that both have careers, that's something that you have to learn to figure out, that leapfrogging. But it's rewarding in a lot of ways too. And what was I going to say? Oh, the other thing that I was remembering was that it's important to have a 5-year plan. So as cheesy as that sounds, we literally sat down and wrote down our 5-year plan 5 years ago. And I don't know if we would have got to where we are now if we hadn't kind of identified those objectives and created, because it's you're talking in years with medical school. You're talking however many years of pre-med, post-bac. Medical school is 4 years. Residency is 3 to 6 years. And then, where do you go after that? So you're talking big chunks of time. And as cheesy as it is, you can go out to a craft store, get a poster board, write down your 5-year plan, try to envision it. Things change along the way, but that was something that I think really helped us.
Yeah, play the long game.
Play the long game.
Great. I don't mean to be intrusive or anything, but how long have you guys been together?
Yeah, we started dating in college. So that was 2013. So I guess it's almost 21.
Yeah, we're
so
coming
almost
up on our 8 years.
Yeah.
8 years.
Yeah.
And we got married in medical school during my third year, right before you matriculated as a first year, Eric. So that's kind of our timeline.
Right. And the reason I asked that is because in addition to, there's the medical relationship, but then there's also the relationship in which, and oftentimes this has been postulated as failing, is when one person is in a career in medicine and the other is not. It sounds like just from your history that, Shelby, you were in medicine at a time that Eric was not. And so in the case of when one person is doing more of the leapfrogging than the other, what advice do you have for people who have relationships like that, where there is one person in a career in medicine that might be very demanding, time-consuming, etc., versus the other partner? What advice do you have for that certain situation?
I think that's really perceptive of you, Andrew. That was definitely, I think, the most challenging time of our kind of process was when I was in medical school and Eric wasn't yet in medical school, because I was struggling with the demands of it and the stress of it and having what felt like zero time to myself. And Eric, you were struggling with kind of your self-identity and getting into medical school, and that's a whole nother bag of worms. And I think we had to really, and on top of that, we were apart because, as you mentioned, the leapfrogging, it's hard to always be in the same place as a couple. And so what do you think our takeaway? I do remember that being a very challenging time, and I think we had to learn to be very forgiving of each other, to kind of hop on the plane and try to do a 2-day trip as often as we could. And we had to have a lot of real honest questions about what kind of life we envisioned for each other, and how we were going to make this work.
Yeah. Yeah, again, it comes back to just being tolerant of the struggles your partner's going through at any one time. And then, I mean, it's sort of a make or break thing, which can be healthy, I think, for a relationship. Like you sort of determine whether your visions are similar for the future and the kind of lives you want to live. And if it is, and you want to be together, then you'll work it out kind of no matter what. And if it ends up that that's not the case, then, that happens to a lot of folks their first year of medical school. Like
Sure.
they end up breaking up with their college girlfriend or whatever that is. And that can be okay too. But it's, it sort of brings it into sharp focus one way or the other, I think, which is good.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. There's got to be no golden answer, and no pure cure for the process. It's just got to be open communication. At least that's what I've heard from other providers too, who are in more long-term relationships like that. Yeah, there can't be a golden answer, otherwise everyone would use it. So in general, how is medical school treating you, specifically in times of COVID-19?
Yeah.
Well, I can start because I'm just starting out, right? So I'm doing the basic sciences and the more introductory stuff. We're pretty much all virtual at this point, us first year medical students. And so we have all our lectures pre-recorded, and we do all our testing remotely through a software that monitors us as we take our tests. And we do even our doctoring skills, so interviewing patients and learning the physical exam. Currently, that's all being done remotely, which is suboptimal in some ways. But I think as far as the content is concerned, like just learning the material of medicine, it hasn't been too bad. A lot of folks, even when we're in normal times, will end up streaming their lectures online these days at different medical schools. And so that hasn't changed too much. I think where it's been challenging is like getting to know your classmates, sort of all the small talk, the moments in between, because we have a lot of sessions on Zoom where we're engaging with each other, but it's all sort of professional. And so there isn't as many of those in-between moments where you just sort of get to know people and commiserate a little bit about the challenges, or celebrate how fun it is sometimes, so that you lose out on a little bit of that. So I'm really looking forward to being in person, just to get to know folks a little better.
Yeah. And my experience as a fourth year medical student has been similar. So it's been a lot of virtual conversion to virtual, as the case with people across the world. In March, I'm applying into anesthesia this year for residency. And in March, when the pandemic started, kind of more formally in the hospital, I was on anesthesia month. And that was a particularly high risk month because of the aerosolization of procedures like intubation and things like that. So I was pulled out of the hospital pretty quickly, even before some other clinical students were. And then after that, what followed was a few months of medical students kind of working together, particularly third and fourth years, to kind of do some initiatives where we distributed PPE, we worked on community service projects. And then ever since then, we've kind of been slowly reintegrating back into the clinical space. So third and fourth, so right now, like for example, second years are the clinical students at University of Michigan, and they're still in the hospital, they're doing all their clinical work, even though the first years are mostly virtual. It's important to note that medical students still are working with patients, and that part of medical school isn't being taken away. But if you don't need to be in the clinical space, then you don't have to be in the clinical space. So for me, I'm working on my residency interviews. Those have all been virtual. So I've been able to do a lot of work from home and been working on some research projects and things like that. And I think more than anything, this COVID pandemic, it's been fascinating to watch as a medical student and to kind of be part of the medical system and team, but also be still a learner. It's a really interesting perspective because we weren't essential workers, we weren't frontline workers, but we were part of that team in a way, and we were watching, and I think some of us felt pretty helpless, and that was something that we struggled with. But at the same time, it has really just highlighted what a privileged position this is to be in the healthcare field and how important this work is. And I think it's just a super important time more than ever to be a part of the medical field.
Yeah. Yeah, there's actually, I don't know if you've heard, but some sort of news report in which it's deemed as the Fauci effect, because there's like a 27% or something increase in medical school applications because so many people are drawn to medicine now, with the pandemic being such a big news story and a big impact on people's lives. And a lot of pre-meds at Carroll are concerned, specifically as pre-meds who aren't applying right now, who haven't had that direct clinical experience, how they're going to be able to tell for themselves or teach themselves that medicine is right for them. Do you have any advice as to, in these times, how pre-meds can help to define that for themselves in not in-person means, whether or not medicine is right for them? Could there be some sort of a shift towards more book work or studying, or maybe working on certain certifications? What advice would you have for the pre-med, I guess what I'm asking, in particular, who is trying to define themselves in times in which in-person interactions might not be possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think number one, fortunately, hopefully we'll be emerging from this, the COVID times sooner rather than later. But for folks right now, some of my classmates from my program last year are applying in this cycle. And I think people have managed to find opportunities to still work indirectly with medicine. So, doing clinical research in the sense of like analyzing data remotely can work. I think providers have been accessible to people reaching out to them during this time, because everything can be done over Zoom and online. So people shouldn't hesitate to reach out to, folks in fields that interest them. And you might even be able to do like virtual shadowing. At Michigan, we have some student-run clinics and programs that actually see patients via Zoom. And it's always kind of easy for someone to just be muted in the Zoom call and observing that interaction. So I think it might be a little more complicated, but folks shouldn't hesitate to try to reach out to doctors and see if they'd be open to shadowing virtually or just discussing things over Zoom, because it's actually a unique time where people are so willing to just get on their computer and talk to you. Otherwise, it might have been harder to reach them. Mm-hmm. Other than that, reading widely this time, just to read about all aspects of medicine and figure out where in that you might want to fit could be helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think reading and participating in Zoom conferences, calls, conversations, I think take advantage of that. But I think when I was applying to medical school, I didn't feel like, there were certainly attendings and residents that I knew and that I had conversations with, but I think for the most part, it was kind of a black box. And my main objective was to get into medical school, and then I was going to figure it out once I got there. But I think right now, like Eric was just saying, this is really a unique opportunity. People are very willing to have conversations, to sit down in their own homes and talk to you about what their lives are like, just like we're doing right now. I think this is so productive to talk to people and to get to know what makes them tick, what their experience in medicine is like. It's really not just about getting to medical school. It's about figuring out what that world is like, what the culture is like at different institutions. And I think that this is a really good time to get to know that. And I think just reading too about, reading on forums, reading about perspectives. I think residents right now are going through a lot of struggles with all of the frontline work that they've had to do. And I think that would be interesting to read some blog posts about that, to read about their perspectives and what they've gone through. And challenging times really show you are very enlightening. And so I think this is actually a very unique time to be going into medicine. And despite the fact that there's a big surge in applications, I have faith that you guys will figure it out and end up where you need to be.
Yeah, and just a note of reassurance, I think having heard conversations among admissions personnel, they're very understanding that this will limit, especially for younger students coming out of undergrad, this will really limit the exposure you might have been able to have in person. And I don't think that'll be held against you, because that's really well understood, at least by a lot of medical school admissions personnel. So yeah, I think if folks just focus on crafting their narrative and writing an excellent application, they'll be in a good position, even if they couldn't get, those 300 hours or whatever they wanted of shadowing. I don't think that will hold you back so much. So I think people should still go for it.
Transform the hand you're dealt.
Yeah,
Make the most of
and
it.
worst comes to worst, you could, take 5 or 6 years to get into medical school like me, and I don't know if I've ended up okay, but maybe, we'll see.
You mean old man?
The jury's out. Yeah, you can be an old person in medical school.
I mean, you've made it, yeah, and that's great advice as far as the way to still explore medicine in these times. Usually, the sort of response that I will give as well to people who ask me in the pre-med club is to not forget the whole holistic admissions process that we were alluding to earlier, but also to look into to remember that non-clinical experience is another important aspect of not only fulfilling a spot on an application, but defining who you are. I mean, if you are the head of a soccer team and the pandemic happens, forces a shutdown, still figuring out a way to engage with people and members of that soccer team and keep them some sense of involvement and some sense of team still. I mean, what an excellent way to demonstrate your adaptability and to build yourself and continue doing something that you're passionate about. And if there's one thing that medical schools and advisors have recommended to me and countless other pre-meds is to have continuity in the things that you love. And so even if you're not able to get into a hospital, oh my gosh, organize something in your community, organize some sort of support team, or continue one of your passions, one of your outlets that aren't directly involved with sick patients. Maybe it's dealing with well patients, because dealing with well patients is another aspect of medicine in general, wellness exams, and also different coworkers that you'll have. So I love to ask guests about that because it's great to know more insight into how to explore specifically medicine too. But I always like to remind Carroll pre-meds that really the process is more about defining yourself than it is about establishing, or it's equivalent to exploring medicine. The process of being a pre-med is about defining who you are and figuring out what that is. And I think as far as defining who you are goes, 2020 has been a year in which people have had monumental experiences, which usually comes from experiencing adversity. Mm-hmm. So I must ask both of you, what is the most important moment you've experienced in 2020, and why was that so impactful?
Yeah, I mean, I think this one was pretty easy. I think definitely when we got married this last summer, I think it was a challenge just to make that wedding happen. Mm-hmm. It's something we'd been looking forward to for so many years. And ultimately it just ended up being our immediate families, at a house together, a really small ceremony. But yeah, I think it was like such a culmination of all these years of us trying to be in the same place and align our lives. So that was incredibly meaningful. It was just a small group of our family. So it just emphasized the importance of family and the centrality of family. And I think that's been brought to the fore by the pandemic as well. Yeah, it's definitely our wedding for me. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a beautiful day. And I think kind of ties into this whole metaphor that we're talking about in general, is that, you're dealt a hand, and, the question is how are you going to adapt? How are you going to be resilient? How are you going to make something beautiful out of the opportunities and the things that you were given? And so I think we did a great job with that. It was a beautiful day, and it was just really a team effort, and our families were able to come together, and it was something that I'll never forget. I think it'll be something that I'm excited to tell my grandchildren about this one.
Unforgettable.
I'll put it that way.
Sure.
Yeah, this is going to be one of those cool things to look back on in the future and laugh about, which oftentimes comes with challenges. It's great to look back on them and to reminisce about them. And from me, absolutely, congratulations for your marriage, and I wish you in the future a great future, healthy future, and great success in your professions as well. And so as we're wrapping things up, and as the Carroll Pre-Med student is listening to this and struggling on their journey and worrying about getting clinical experience and just dealing with dynamics at home, as well as figuring out who they are, what final words of wisdom do you have for these Carroll pre-medical students?
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, I think, you all will make it to where you want to go. I think I've had a longer journey where I've explored different careers and gone in different directions, and at times that felt like I was missing out by not having gone to med school right away. And now it's really turned into, a privilege because I've gotten to experience these different things, and I'm certain that medicine is really where I wanted to end up. So I think embracing that journey and embracing the fact that it might take a while, it might work out quickly, it might take a while. No matter how it works out, you're going to struggle at different points. So learning to embrace that struggle is important and see that struggle as valuable and interesting. It's a little bit of a stoic mindset, but it parallels, a lot of what we do in the outdoors. Like that's kind of like why we like to go into the mountains in Montana, to challenge ourselves and, push ourselves in different ways. So yeah, learning to embrace that struggle is important, because even if you fly right through into the med school you want to go to, at some point there, you'll be challenged in a way you've never been challenged before. And so everyone faces that struggle at some point on the journey, whether they fly through the process or not. And if you go through that struggle before you get into med school, you're a little stronger for it, and med school might go a little smoother. So yeah, embrace those challenges and know that if you stick with it, even if it takes you 5 or 6 or 10 years to get into medical school, you can make it and have a fulfilling career.
Mm-hmm. There's a certain level of alchemy to it, that struggle.
Yeah.
It's important. It's part of the process. So don't freak out if you're struggling, but that's part of the process, and that's normal. And try to transform yourself along the way, is what I think you were just saying. And for me, I think something that I've mentioned this earlier, but I think the most important thing in my experience has been building and maintaining a support system. So finding the people that are your loved ones, make sure that you don't kind of get short-sighted and forget about that, and forget about how important that is to your life. Remember that there are more important things to medical school, and that these are the people that are going to be really propelling you and cheering you on and celebrating your successes. So it's important to maintain that relationship and take care of them and allow them to take care of you.
And with that, we end another episode of Carroll PMC's video interview series and wrap up another story for you guys. A story in which I believe we successfully touched on the merits of taking risks. Some of Eric and Shelby's risks are quite obvious by virtue of the adventurous lifestyle the two live together. However, the risks of being a pre-medical student and pursuing a career in medicine must not be neglected. There are financial risks by virtue of the immense amount of debt that medical students must take on for medical education. There are social risks because of the immense amount of hours one must invest into studying, into shadowing, into clinical and non-clinical experiences that may over time eat away at some of the relationships that one has with their family and with their friends. And quite frankly, there are health risks by virtue of the current COVID-19 pandemic. There are, and also by virtue of just hospital settings in general, there are plenty of opportunities for this type of work to cause one to contract different viruses, different illnesses, and different diseases as well. But what I think Eric and Shelby's experiences really greatly highlighted was the benefits of facing the unknown, the benefits of taking on a challenge that one might not think they could overcome, and then surprising themselves and overcoming it. And Eric and Shelby, by facing their challenges in their own lives, they are on track to enter into careers that they are destined for, and that are going to bring a lot of alleviation of suffering, that are going to help positively impact many people. There's an old saying that says nothing good happens inside of your comfort zone. And I think if we follow along with some of Eric and Shelby's experiences and some of their actions they've taken to pursue their careers in medicine, I think we can achieve that same type of success in our own lives. Thank you for taking the time to listen and or watch me today. Hopefully this helped you guys gain some motivation or insight into what it takes to be a successful pre-medical student. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to your Carroll PMC officers, schedule an office hour slot with myself on Moodle, or consult with Carroll faculty of your choosing. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time.